the most recent addition from North Carolina was Ven-Allen Lubin.
Yep.
Uh, he's listed as 6'8". I think we all can agree that might be a little bit of a stretch. But he played kind of a small ball five at Vanderbilt,
Yeah.
transferring in. I want to ask you, what's the first thing you see about his game as it stands, independent from anything North Carolina wants to do? What do you see when you watch him?
I see a potential mismatch problem. I mean, in full disclosure, he was someone that I saw and evaluated in high school, probably more so than I have in the last 2 years, certainly live. And that was really the thing from high school, is that this was a broadly built guy, broad shoulders, presumably long arms, who could mismatch you because he could face up and put on the floor and do different things. And I think, since especially last year, when he got to Vanderbilt, he started to add a little bit of a post game and has a little sneaky bounce in there too. At Notre Dame, that his first school, I think Mike Bray was a really interesting head coach for him because he let those five men face the basket. And again, this was someone who was interesting because of his ability to kind of face up against less mobile bigs and play make a little bit, or certainly play out of DHOs and stuff like that. So, and then you take him to Vanderbilt and he had to get a little more nasty to his game under Jerry Stackhouse. So I think the consequence of all of that has been, just a really multi-dimensional player who's continued to get better throughout the course of the last 2 years, can beat you in a variety of different ways, but is at his best as a small ball five, unless you've got like a rare situation where you can play him with like a stretch five, which I don't know that that's something you'll see next year. But yeah, I do think he tends to be at his best facing the basket because he's really not a shooter.
And how would you assess him defensively?
So in full disclosure, I asked the Vanderbilt staff that same question because I think a lot of times I find it very difficult to scout these guys defensively, and I think a lot of times it's difficult because like we don't know what the scheme is. You know what I mean? Like you think you do, but lots of times the executing the game plan is vastly different than what comes through on TV or even in person. So but I'll say this, that and I'm not even saying this because it's a North Carolina podcast, but Jerry Stackhouse's reputation on that end of the floor is very strong, and it's long before he got to the college ranks. I remember talking to people when he was coaching in the G League about what a disciplinarian he was on that end of the floor. So I would venture to guess that this guy, Ven-Allen Lubin, got extreme growth on that end last year because there was a newfound accountability that should really benefit North Carolina next year, because he's been well schooled on that end of the floor. And as I said, I think he's got a broad build. He's got some length. He's not going to be overly switchable, but I think he's going to be able to guard some bigger fives because of that lower center of gravity, long arms, big upper body, and guard most fours as well, but not the guy you're going to want to switch 1 through 5 with.
And that kind of led to my next question is like, in the offseason, Carolina obviously targeted a big. They wanted, traditional 6'10", 6'11", 7-foot guy. And once they kind of struck out on a few of those, they moved on in a different direction. Do you think you need to win a national championship that 6'11", 250 type guy, your Jonas Haydu, your Cliff Amore, your Zach Edey, Hunter Dickinson, on and on and on? Do you need that to win a national championship, in your opinion?
That's a really good question. I think that you have to have, well, let's just take recent history. Obviously you've got UConn, who's had twin towers, so to speak. I know that's a cliche, but they've had a two center tandem in each of the last 2 years. This year it was Donovan Clingan and Samson Johnson. The year before it was Adamo Sanogo and Donovan Clingan. I thought what was interesting about both of those teams is they had versatility in the way they could guard you. So they had rim protectors. Donovan Clingan, someone who's going to be a drop coverage type big, but then they could come at you with Samson Johnson, be more of like an athletic rim runner. So I do think you need to have some rim protection. You can try and get creative with it. I don't think you need to have a guy you can throw it to on the post. In fact, I would argue that Klingan's low post game was vastly overrated this year, and that what they did a really good job of, and you guys saw it, when in the Garden where Carolina played UConn in December, Clingan was not himself, was not particularly good that day. But So I don't know that you need a low post guy that you can throw it into and say, go to work. But I do think you need some rim protection. You need to be able to finish possessions in the defensive end. So whether or not they can do that with this lineup, I think remains to be seen. But Lubin is someone who I do think is going to be able to rebound if he like really commits to it. I'd say that's like the untapped upside of his game is like, can this guy really become a dominant rebounder? I'm interested to see that.
So I guess, and this is a little bit of a nebulous question, Adam, but because you're such a versatile guy, I'm going to throw this at you anyway. How do you think Lubin fits with North Carolina's, what's going to be a predominantly backcourt driven team next year? Again, we don't know who's going to get all the minutes, but you're returning the ACC Player of the Year and first team All American and RJ Davis. Elliot Cadeau is obviously going to be your starting point guard, and Seth Trimble is going to be back. But I would ask you, how do you think he plays with that sort of a cemented and talented backcourt?
So the short answer is I'm not really sure, because I think what you have to see is a little bit of a pivot in terms of how North Carolina plays, right? Because he's not Armando Bacot. Like you can't play exactly like that. And as I said, if you're playing him at the 5, I think part of his value is being able to create mismatches. You put him in short roll situations because he can make catches, he can put the ball on the floor, he can make decisions, he can pass the ball. You put him in dribble handoff action. So that kind of yields to more of a modern day half court offense than what we see a lot of college basketball teams run these days, which is kind of this throwback, with a low post center and stuff like that. So I'm not sure how much of that we're going to see, but I do think there's a term that I've used before, like it'll open up the playbook for Hubert Davis. Like I think it'll allow him to run different kind of actions and invert lineups and show potentially a level of creativity in the playbook that was not available to him with last year's personnel. So that's what I think is the interesting part, because he's different than Bacot is, and presuming that they don't find some surprise starting center here late, it's going to be a different type of roster construction next year at North Carolina, at least as far as I know. You guys, I'm sure, have a better feeling of that than I do, but I don't expect it to just plug them into those roles and see the same system we saw last year.